again. Good morning. Glad you are all here. We will continue our class. Let me see if I can screen share. There we go. We will.
You want to stay on there? You want to get over there?
If you can get it on there.
There we go. All right. So for the last 5 weeks, we have looked at the 5 major theories of atonement, the different ways that Jesus saves. And we see that each has their strengths and weaknesses. Every one of them has something that counts and matters. And some, some seem to be a little stronger and some a little more weak, but they all have their options. So what we're going to do real quick, we'll look at the overview just to see where we are. First, substitutionary atonement. That's the one we started with. It's the dominant theory in the West. And this is that classic, Jesus died as a satisfaction for our sins. That's where it started. It became penal substitutionary theory. Jesus died for our sins as payment. So Jesus is paid for our sins. We are free to go. It's how God's grace is enacted in the world. So it's straightforward, it's clear, it's transactional. However, it places God as an angry tyrant that seeks the death of Jesus in payment, the death of his own son. It's not really a complimentary portrait of God the Father. Jesus comes out well as one willing to die on our behalf, but God is not such a great situation. It also is a situation that valorizes suffering. If Jesus suffered, so should we. And if you've done something wrong, then you should pay for it and pay heavily. Both of these are side effects of the theory. They're not meant to be the main part of the theory, but it's a very clear connection to how people view atonement theory. If they have this idea of substitutionary atonement, especially penal substitutionary atonement, then they've got a pretty good idea that we should pay and pay mightily. Second, we're in moral influence theory. This was Abelard critiquing the previous substitutionary atonement theory. This was much more the idea that Jesus' whole life, not just the crucifixion, not just his death, but his whole life should be a model for how to live our lives, and not his death. We shouldn't just focus on Good Friday and Easter. We should focus on everything that he did as an example. And so through Jesus' obedience and life, we are forgiven and shown a better way. Okay? Throughout his life, he showed what it is to be a better person, and so we too can be better people because of what Jesus did and showed us how to be better. The problems are pretty obvious and clear, though. Are we that much better off than we were 2,000 years ago? Has humanity increased or done better? In some ways, I think you can argue we are. In some others, we are not at all better people. It just depends, but not in a way that is progress, I would say. And while Jesus' perfect obedience also leads to suffering, not to the degree of substitutionary atonement theory, but there's still this idea that Jesus suffers as part of God's plan in this theory, right? That God had it all mapped out and planned. Jesus is obedient even to the cross, and that, again, that suffering is still part of our experience, and we too will suffer. So we don't get out of that. In this situation, we get out of God as tyrant, as bloodthirsty tyrant, but we don't get out of suffering. And then this one also gets a little more vague. If all of Jesus' life is about obedience, couldn't he have shown us how to be obedient without having to die on the cross? And Abelard's never quite as clear about why Jesus had to die on the cross or why that was such a similar part of this. Since he divorces it from payment for sin, it becomes less inside, which is a critique ultimately of the theory because it's not as clear exactly how Jesus covers all the bases and makes sure that everything is set to right, and we are atoned for our sins, and there's atonement, that is, we are in relationship with God. Next, we reviewed the Christus Victor theory. And the Christus Victor theory came from the ancient ransom theory of atonement. The idea here was in sinning, humanity has fallen under the power of Satan and the forces of evil. So when we break the rules, then we lose our place with God, instead are counted with, well, the lesser forces of evil and with Satan. Christ must come and pay the ransom or defeat Satan on our behalf, depending on which. Christus Victor is much more, has to defeat Satan in battle, while the ransom theory is much more pay the ransom, obviously, from the title. Either way, in that theory, it's very clear what Christ came to do. He came to save us from the powers of evil, and to do that by getting us back from Satan and from evil. So in this case, salvation comes when the devil sees Jesus' humanity on the cross and consumes him, or takes him down to hell. This is where, in the Apostles' Creed, he descended into hell, or he descended to the dead, depending on which way they translate that. It's the same idea either way, that Jesus died on the cross, and he was taken down to break loose the doors of hell and save everyone who was stuck there. And the great quote, and this comes from Allen, as a fish swallows the bait on the fish hook, so the devil swallows his prey and is thereby taken captive by the Godhead, hidden under the human nature. So this is sometimes called the bait and switch, right? Jesus literally on the cross, the devil sees his humanity and the sinfulness of humanity on Jesus, takes him down to hell, and then when Jesus is there, realizes he's made a horrible mistake, and Jesus breaks everyone out. Now, there's a couple of problems. Which is better, an angry God, like in substitutionary atonement theory, or a trickster God? The trickster God, I'm not sure, is all that much better. Either way, you have a God that doesn't seem to be, well, consonant with love and support and connection, right? He has to trick somebody, or he's mad at somebody. The other fundamental question is, who's in control here, right? If the devil has this much control, doesn't that limit the authority of God? If God has to create this trick and this situation to figure out a way to get everyone out of hell, then does he really have all of the power, or is there some degree of a multitude of gods? Or we get into that mythology very quickly, and this whole thing then is very mythological. Is there a literal battle with swords? Does Jesus sort of pop out a la Trojan horse style in hell with a blazing sword and fight his way out of hell against angry demons? Is it a more metaphorical battle between good and evil? How does all of this work? It gets very mythological very quickly, because it's a question of who is in charge and what's going on. And there's not clarity around that. Instead, it's just sort of a broad idea that Jesus comes, he smashes the gates of hell, frees everyone from their bondage, and sets them free to get to heaven. So, those are the issues with the ransom theory. Girard came next in Girardian theory, which, summing this up in a couple of slides, is the trickiest part by far. But just a quick reminder of how this works. Humanity learns through mimicking one another. We share our desires because we imitate the person next to us who tells us about those desires. Because we share desires, known as mimetic desires, we tend to end up in competition with each other. We create mimetic rivals. That is, we copy the fact that we both want the same thing, and then we end up fighting against each other for it. And even if we don't necessarily care about the object, because the other person wants it, then I want it even more. It affirms this sort of gross cycle of desire, and mimetic desire and mimetic rivalry feed on each other, so that if I want the red sports car and someone else wants the red sports car, that other person wanting it proves that it's worthwhile to strive for it and to fight for it. That rivalry then leads to open conflict, which is mimetic desire, leads to mimetic rivalry, which then leads eventually to mimetic conflict. People fight about wanting that red sports car. They fight about wanting the perfect place on the beach, the perfect whatever it might be, right? And sometimes it might be the perfect place, but more often than not, if we think about it, we end up just saying we want something because 12 other people want it, not necessarily because we have found something new, unique, or different. So in this process of mimetic desire, mimetic rivalry, and mimetic conflict, things start to spiral into conflict and violence. And the only way to get out of it, we have learned as humans, is to pick a scapegoat, to put all our anger on someone else, to unify with that mimetic rival by saying, well, we both want that red sports car, but it's all that person's fault that we can't get it. And we see that all the time in our society. We have those scapegoats that we point to, be they African Americans, Jews, LGBTQ community. You go down the list and you will hear immigrants. There are an endless list of people that get singled out unfairly. They're innocent of any of the situations that they're being blamed for typically. They just get blamed so that that energy can go somewhere and people can be united against someone else. So the killing of the scapegoat then restores order. That degree of casting out the other or literally killing the other, the scapegoat restores order, and it's found especially in many of the primitive religions. Killing a goat, killing a sheep, killing a lamb, killing, well, just about anything or anyone restores that order and sets you back to even. So Girard notices all of that and says the Bible is the revelation of that what we are doing to one another is wrong. We're doing all of this, and specifically that the scapegoat is always innocent of the crime of which they're accused, that we just gin this all up so that we can get out of the situation, out of that conflict. Jesus died in Girardian theory to reveal the forces that bind us in this world and set us free. Again, that's a super fast and perhaps even simplistic version of Girard, but that's the ideas behind Girard. In Girardian theory, then, Jesus provides a positive example of how to live a good life, much like the moral influence theory. His whole life matters, but even more, there is that sort of correction that now we know why he died for us in Girardian theory, that nonviolent atonement. So the critiques of this theory, though, are much the same as moral influence theory. Are we really better off than 2,000 years ago? It's hard to know when we scapegoat someone too, right? I mean, it's easy for us to point and say that person over there is scapegoating someone, but when we get frustrated or lash out at someone who is innocent of the situation, we are not always good about seeing our own blind spots, our own scapegoats. And finally, we came to the physical atonement theory, or theosis, which we talked about last week. In Paul, we see that Jesus is the new Adam. Where the old Adam failed, Jesus redeems. That is, where the old Adam was sinful and broken, Jesus comes and does everything again to show that we can be faithful to God in the midst of it. This is called recapitulation. Jesus redeems humanity by becoming human in a life of obedience. Again, this should sound familiar to moral influence theory and even to Girard. All three have this idea that Jesus' obedience is the key to understanding his presence on earth, that his ability to lead a godly life is what's important. Irenaeus then proclaimed Christ became what we are in order to enable us to become what he is. This is the idea of theosis, that by being human, Christ redeems humanity and brings God into the human sphere, and then brings humanity into the Trinity. He learns what it is to be human, to be hungry, to be tired, to not know everything that's going on, and he brings that humanity into the Trinity. And through that combination, we are then brought into oneness with God. That atonement happens through that perfect obedience, but specifically through that sharing of our natures so that we understand each other better. So then, theosis is that idea that we can become more and more like God through perfect obedience, even becoming like God or even God, depending on which author you read about that. The critique here is the same as moral influence in Girardian theory. Are we that better off than we were before Jesus than 2,000 years ago? Maybe not. The other question that people fundamentally have with this theory, apart from just getting nervous about someone saying they can be like God or they can become God, do we lose our humanity when we become part of God? What happens to the individual as we become more and more connected to the divine? Is it possible for us to be independent and connected at the same time? Those are some of the questions that theosis can bring up. All right, so let me pause there. We have 5 theories of salvation and the idea and how this might work. Does anybody have any questions about, I just literally covered 5 weeks of classes and 2,000 years of Christian theology in about 10 slides, 20 slides. Questions about all of that, or even from previous classes, if you are wondering about how some of these things might work. Nope, that's fine. As always, stop me along the way if you need to, or I want clarity. So now what do we do with this, right? What's the point of this class is the most fundamental question that people might have. And that is, on one level, I am perfectly content to say this is all above my pay grade, right? It's sort of a joke, but it's not completely false. I don't get to decide who is in and who is out of heaven, and I am glad not to have that responsibility. And I am glad not to have a situation where I have to answer this question definitively. I don't know that it matters how this question is answered definitively. What matters more is this sort of idea of atonement. How do we get home to God? So I don't know is my most fundamental answer. I don't know how God saves us through his son, Jesus. I just hope I get in. On one level, that's the most fundamental answer. It's the simple answer, but it might be a little too simplistic. There are things that matter. The theories we reviewed all point to important truths about God and Jesus. I think it's important to have an idea of how this works, especially when we start talk about some of the critiques of the theories, because they do have these shadow sides. When we're talking about substitutionary atonement and the sort of valorizing suffering, or talking about how people need to pay for their crimes, it's very easy to see a very clear through line from that theory, from penal substitutionary theory, for instance, and the fact that the United States has now had done 2 federal executions in the last, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? And most of the language you've heard around that is it's time for these people to pay for what they did. It's literally a simple through line for that penal substitutionary theory is all drawn up in that. If they did wrong, then they must be punished, and we are the ones to punish, or we need to make sure that that punishment comes down. It's not to get into the debate necessarily about should we have capital punishment or not. It's just to note that these are very clearly connected ideas in the world. And people who subscribe to penal substitutionary atonement theory are much more likely to support longer jail times, harsher sentences, execution, and the idea of prison as suffering. You have to pay for your sin, right? So it matters when we point to those kinds of truths. It matters to know how these theories work so that we can know the shadow sides. All 5 theories are struggling with why God became human and chose to save us. This is one of the most fundamental questions that Christians have had almost from the start is, well, Jesus came to save us, but why? Why would you do that? What would be the point of doing that, right? Why would someone who is divine, who literally has everything in the world, want to come and live a messy, funky human life, right? The human body is not always our best friends. We have to fight and wrestle with all sorts of things at all sorts of different ages. We don't get to know everything like God. We're working at best with maybe 20% of the truth and just doing the best we can, guessing the best ways forward. It'd be awful nice to be more omniscient, maybe not completely omniscient, but closer to omniscient. So why would God choose to live among us? That's what all 5 of these are trying to figure out. why he had to do this, why he had to die, why Jesus gathered among us. And again, we can simplistically reduce it to the fact that God loves us and calls it, and we can call it grace. That is, God that so loved the world, right? As John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son to the end that all that believe in him should not perish. It's God's love, and it's ultimately then God's grace. God just chooses to love us anyway, even though we're sinful, even though our world is broken, even though our institutions are pretty darn fallible and messed up, God just chooses to love us. And so we can be simplistic and even reductionist and just say, well, that's it. That's all we need to know. Or we can focus on it a different way. We can marvel at the idea that, like Paul did, that while we were still sinners, while we still were sinners, Christ died for us. That's the heart of the Christian message. The amazing part is, here we are as broken human beings, and God still chose, even then, especially when we weren't reconciled. It is through this adoption, as Paul would say, in our baptism, we are adopted children of Christ. The traitor is welcomed home as a beloved child. That's grace. In a nutshell, that is the heart of the Christian message and faith. And all five of these are trying to pierce the veil a little bit about that. How did that happen? How does that work? How does this grace thing work itself out? And sometimes we're even more concerned about, why do we deserve it? So we're welcomed home as adopted children through baptism. That's what Paul talks about in both Colossians and Ephesians. Now what? What does all this mean? So each of the theories posit on one level or another that our actions are part of the story. This is the part that people get perhaps the most anxious about. On the one hand, the world all require, that is, on one hand, these theories, each of the theories, 100% standalone. They don't require human action to complete salvation. Salvation is done with Jesus, by Jesus, and God. It's all done through them. It doesn't require us. But at the same time, there's this idea of response. That is, Girardian theory, the moral influence theory, and physical theory / theosis all require it. That is, we've been adopted, we've been saved, Jesus shows us a way to live life, and so we should then live it. It's required of us as a response to that salvation, for the most part. You have to, if you're going to believe that moral influence theory, Girardian theory, or physical theory work, you have to be prepared to now live a more sacred, holy, and faithful. And the Christus, I forgot the U on the Christus Victor see it as a response to salvation. So we are saved, therefore we should respond with gratitude, and we should try to live a better life. It's not as clear, though, in the Christus Victor and in the substitutionary atonement theory that you have to do anything. That's sort of the irony of those theories. While they're incredibly clear about this transactional moment of us being saved, it is not as clear about what we are to do in response. They would all say we need to respond in gratitude and grace in gratitude to the grace shown to us, but it's not quite as required as it is in Girard and in moral influence and physical theory. So while we can wonder about which theory is correct, we can argue about it, we can go back and forth on it, we can say I prefer one or the other of each of these, or I like three of them but I don't like that one. That's fine. We're supposed to respond, is the reality of it. That is, let me say it differently, each salvation theory leads us to a different understanding. So we might emphasize scapegoats. If we're talking about Girard, we might emphasize suffering. If we're talking about moral influence or substitutionary atonement, we might emphasize connection to God. If we're talking about that theosis, physical atonement theory. But maybe we just accept that all three are part of life. All three are part of what we do as humans. That is, on some level, I think each of these theories might be right all the way through, and it's just part of life that we have to have, that we should be seeking these three things. We should be seeking a deeper connection. We should be worried about scapegoats and about those who are being falsely accused, and we should worry and engage suffering, not valorize it, but work to ameliorate that suffering. But we're required to engage it, right? That's one thing we don't get let off on. If Jesus went to all this trouble, then we got to do something in response. Our salvation is worked out through Jesus and God in these theories, but we are called to engage and respond to that redemption and release. So, to put it in clear and Pauline, there's absolutely no works righteousness to this. If we're going to go purely, I mean, not Paul, but Paul says it in part, but really it's Luther who gets worked up about this. Martin Luther would famously say that we cannot get caught in works righteousness, that it is all grace. It is all God who first loves us, first saves us, first reaches out to us, that we then respond to, and that our works then are just a response to that grace and to knowing that we are cared for and loved and redeemed. So we have to care, we are called to engage and respond to that redemption and release with thanksgiving, with joy, and with action. Now, I've taught this class. I love teaching it because it shows the different ideas about how God saves. And it reminds us of that grace that is amazing. The song gets it right. It is amazing to think that at any given day when we're really messing things up and things aren't going right, that God still is constantly coming to save us. He's still constantly trying to be engaged with us and loves us. And because God chooses to love us in spite of ourselves and goes to extremes to show it, the result is a life of blessing and joy. If we understand that we are sinful and broken, if we understand that God loves us and redeems us, then our best response is just blessing and joy. Our life is pretty good because we are beloved children of God. And so it does not make things easy, but if we start with love, then we should respond with love, finding ways to make the world better and filled with more hope and love. If we can do that, then I think we get behind really the ideas of all five of these theories, that while we don't know exactly which one is right and we don't know exactly how they all work, what it really comes down to is this fundamental idea that one way or another, Jesus chose to live among us. One way or another, Jesus chose to teach us and help us. And one way or another, Jesus chose to die for us and be raised again, which are no small feats. Questions, thoughts, comments? Man, we got it all figured out. We got grace, we got salvation, we got it all.
Let's see. Am I on mute?
All right, we got,
So,
I think
Bill,
I'm going to look real quick. This is the last Sunday school class for the summer. We're going to wait until after Labor Day to start the next one, in part because of timing, but in part also Kenny and I are going to be leading conversations around race and community. We were hoping to start that beginning of August, but with the mayor and Sandy Springs starting their conversations, we wanted to give that room to have those conversations if any of you are involved in that. And then our first class, again, that'll probably start right after Labor Day. We'll go for about 5-6 weeks talking about different ways of understanding race, understanding our the history of our race relationships in this country, but even more, how do we work on caring for one another and supporting one another and understanding one another in this difficult time. So that's the next thing coming up. It's been great to be with all of you. Any other questions or any thoughts?
John was trying to say
Thank you.
something.
It's been very helpful.
Thank you, Len. John, were you trying to ask a question?
Well, I think I listened to the first one and now the last one. So I missed all the in between. and then I came in late on this one. But, you know, these theories, has it been 2,000 years of work to develop these, or kind of, I mean, I'm sure you explained that as we went along, but throughout Christianity, is this one of the fundamental questions that we've been trying to answer, and these people have been working on it, I guess, for many, many years.
Yes, I mean, there are, all of these have been bouncing around in various forms for a long time. Girard is probably the one that is the most recent and newest. Literally, he wrote his books in the last 50, 60 years. So Girard is the one that is the most recent. Each of the others might have proponents at different points in history. Like substitutionary atonement theory really got fully defined by Anselm of Canterbury in around 1100 AD. But it was picking up on an older theory in the same way that the Christus Victor theory got explained in the 1930s and everyone was reminded of it. It was one that Origen and some of the earliest teachers in the church were working on. So I think part of that just speaks to how the church continues to wrestle with these ideas and which one matters and which one do we understand and how. They all end up being advanced and picked up by different communities and different people, which then in turn leads to very specific sort of responses to that. Substitutionary atonement theory, like I said, was around 1100 when Anselm picked it up. It sort of went a little bit more quietly for a while, and then it got reinvigorated actually with the Protestant Reformation, because most of those folks started picking up penal substitutionary versus the other theories and loved it, and that was when it went to penal substitutionary atonement theory when it got to Calvin. So all of these have ebbed and flowed in different ways throughout our history, and depending on which part of the church. The physical theory comes in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it's from the very beginning, but even then the Orthodox Church is constantly revising and engaging it in different ways, and what does it mean to this new generation? So I think, yeah, John, the answer to your questions is yes, each of these around, again, almost all of these have been around for a good 2,000 years. Almost all of them have been wrestled with, and we're all still trying to figure out which one means what and why. If you want to go back, you're welcome to. I've recorded all of them, and I've put them all up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel at Holy Innocents Atlanta. So if you go on there, there's a section just how does Jesus save?
Right.
And that's a place you can find all of it.
Very good.
Up on the betweens.
Well, look forward to the conversations around race. I mean, this is, the timing is right, but we've been needing to do this for 150 years. And it's the thing we've all danced around and ignored. And, it's hard, but we need to start talking about it.
It is. I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be a good class. Kenya's already put together a spectacular list of resources. The idea is, we're calling it the 12-day challenge, that there's 12 different days that have lots of different resources to try and fit different people's needs. It's not all just Mercy is a great book, but it's not simply just read Just Mercy and then we'll talk about Just Mercy. It's here's a video, here's a sermon, here's a podcast, here's different people talking about it in different ways to try and help people have parts of that conversation where they can. Some people like to read books, some people like podcasts. Some people have 8 minutes to look at something, and some have 2 days to look at something. So each, giving folks ways to engage different ideas in this topic, and then we'll draw back together each week to have conversations about what people heard and how it struck them and where it challenged them, because this should be a process that challenges us. It will not be an easy conversation, but it's a worthwhile one.
Excellent. Okay.
Good deal, my friends. Well, y'all have a great week, and my family's going down to the beach for a week, so we're gonna do beach and condo, and that's about it. Just scenery and a way to get out of the house for the first time in 4 months or whatever it's been. So looking forward to that, but we'll miss you next week, and we'll see you soon.
We did that last week, 2 weeks ago, and it's well worth the time. Condo to beach, and that's all you need.
That's all you need.
Yep. Okay, well, thank
Perfect.
you.